thought I was about to die the moment our eyes met. 3 people before me had done the same thing. None of them made it home. The next morning, their lockers were empty. Security said they'd quit. No one believed it. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the silver tray, and my heart was pounding like a drum in an empty cathedral. The rule was brutally simple. Rule number 1, never look him in the eye. I thought it was just the quirk of a bored billionaire, but the second I locked eyes with Andrew, I realized this was about power, raw and terrifying. He didn't yell or move, he didn't even blink. As I stared, I realized with a jolt of horror that his eyes weren't just dark, there was no reflection in his pupils, just 2 bottomless pits of matte black that seemed to swallow the light of the room. I wanted to stammer an excuse, but my throat had closed up completely. Amidst the terror, a dark, intrusive thought flickered through my mind. Maybe dying here in the warmth of this mansion would be easier than going back to starving in my car. After what felt like an eternity, he turned and walked away without a single word, leaving behind a silence so suffocating I remained frozen, clutching the tray as my only tether to reality. You want to know the worst part? I hadn't even meant to look. It started 3 days earlier when I was so hungry I couldn't sleep, the kind of gnawing desperation that makes you willing to do anything. When I saw the listing for a live-in maid at this estate, I didn't think twice. The pay was insane and the requirements were laughably simple. Clean, organize, obey. No experience or references were required. I should have known something was off when they hired me without even asking my last name. But when you're 2 weeks behind on rent, you don't ask questions. The house itself felt alive, with hallways that twisted like a maze and shadows that seemed to move the moment I turned my head. From the second I walked through those doors, I felt a strange heaviness in the air, as if the walls were judging me, waiting to see if I'd survive the night. The other staff members offered nothing but tight-lipped nods and the same haunting warning, don't ever look him in the eye. I thought they were being dramatic until I met Camila. She was confident and sure that nothing bad could actually happen to her. She disappeared 2 days later, her name erased from the schedule as if she'd never existed. That's when I realized this place wasn't just strange, it was a cage. And now, standing in that foyer with my heart still racing, I understood the gravity of my mistake. I had just done the one thing that had cost everyone else their lives. I'd broken the one rule that kept the others safe, and for some reason, he let me. Before I continue with my story, kindly subscribe to the channel and tell me which city you are watching from and what time it is over there. I will read every comment. You know that feeling when someone just vanishes from your life and suddenly everything feels wrong? It's like the air itself has changed, colder, thinner, and you can't quite put your finger on why, but your gut is screaming that something terrible has happened. That's exactly what hit me on Tuesday morning when I realized Camila was gone. And I mean really gone, not just quit her job gone or called in sick gone, but erased from existence gone. The worst part? Nobody seemed to care. The silence in the house wasn't just quiet, it was intentional. I was in the library dusting shelves that probably cost more than my entire life savings when I noticed the shift. It was a weird absence that made the house feel even emptier than usual. I kept expecting to hear Camila's loud, infectious laugh echoing from the break room, or see her walking down the hallway with that confident swagger she had, the kind that said she wasn't scared of anything or anyone. But there was nothing, just a void. When I casually asked one of the other maids if she'd seen Camila today, the woman's face went pale, deathly pale. She didn't just look away, she looked through me. "Don't say her name," she whispered, her voice cracking before she scurried away like I'd just asked her to commit a capital crime. My body understood the danger before my mind did. That reaction told me everything I needed to know. Whatever happened to Camila wasn't an accident, it wasn't a coincidence, and it definitely wasn't something anyone was allowed to talk about. I spent the rest of the day trying to piece together what I knew, replaying every interaction I'd had with her in my head like a detective searching for clues in a cold case. I remembered seeing her walk toward the East Wing the day before, that part of the house where we were explicitly told never to go, a place even the senior staff avoided like it was cursed. She had this smirk on her face, this playful, rebellious look that made me think she was doing it as a joke. She wanted to prove the rules were just scare tactics and nothing bad would actually happen. I watched her disappear through those heavy double doors, and that was the last time I saw her alive. Hours passed, then a full day, and by evening, the other staff were buzzing with a quiet, vibrating panic. One of the older cleaners checked Camila's room and came back shaking her head, her eyes wide and glassy. She said it was completely empty, stripped bare, like she'd never lived there at all. I couldn't wrap my head around the idea that a human being could just be scrubbed from the system without anyone even acknowledging that she'd existed. When I checked the staff schedule the next morning, my hands were trembling so badly I almost couldn't hold the clipboard. Her name was gone. No shifts listed, no contact information, no emergency numbers, just a blank white space where her entire identity used to be. I realized this wasn't just about breaking rules or getting fired. This was about consequences that involved disappearing so completely that even your name became a whisper people were too afraid to say out loud. Driven by a desperation I couldn't ignore, I waited until the house settled into its midnight rhythm. I snuck into the staff break room, my heart hammering against my ribs. I needed a sign. I went straight to her locker, but the lock had been cut clean off, sheared away like paper. I pulled the door open, expecting emptiness. At first, that's all there was. But then, tucked into the very back corner, I saw it. A small, glinting object. I reached in, my fingers brushing against the cold metal floor. It was her silver earring, the one she wore every single day. But as I pulled it into the light, my brain stalled. It refused to process what I was seeing. There was something attached to it. A jagged, dark, leathery piece of something that shouldn't have been there. I held it closer, my breath hitching in my throat, trying to convince myself it was just a scrap of cloth or a piece of jewelry. Then the horror landed. It was a jagged, dried piece of her earlobe, still pierced by the silver post. It had been left there like a discarded piece of waste. This wasn't just a firing, this was a harvest. The realization made me want to scream, but the sound died in my throat. Suddenly, the light in the break room flickered, just once. A sharp, mechanical click echoed from the corner of the ceiling. I froze. I didn't even have to look to know that the eye-level camera had swiveled. It was pointing directly at me. It was watching me hold the evidence of what they had done to her. Every survival instinct I had screamed at me to run, to vanish into the shadows and never look back. I sat on my bed that night, staring at the ceiling, the silver earring hidden beneath my pillow, biting into my palm to keep from sobbing. My mind raced through every possibility, every explanation, and none of them were good. Maybe she ran away? No, her things were here yesterday. In a place this monitored, nobody just walks away. The only explanation that made sense, the one I didn't want to admit but couldn't ignore, was that she'd been removed, erased, made to vanish as a warning to the rest of us. I thought about the cameras I'd noticed in every hallway, the ones that seemed to follow my movements with unnerving precision. I wondered how many people had been watching when Camilla walked into that forbidden wing. How many had seen her break the rule and decided her fate in that exact moment? The house suddenly felt less like a workplace and more like a trap, a beautifully decorated prison where every step was monitored and every mistake was punished. I pulled my blanket tighter around my shoulders, feeling smaller and more terrified than I'd felt since I arrived. Camilla's disappearance wasn't just a tragedy, it was a lesson. A reminder that in this house, the rules weren't suggestions, they were survival instructions, and ignoring them didn't just get you fired, it got you erased. I thought about the overdue rent, the hunger, and the life I'd left behind in my car. I realized then that I wasn't just a maid anymore. I was a witness, and witnesses are just victims who haven't been caught yet. The most terrifying part? I'd already broken the biggest rule of all. I had looked the devil in the eye, and for some reason, he had let me walk away. I wasn't spared, I was being saved, and Here's something that'll make your skin crawl. Imagine discovering that every single move you've made for the past week, every nervous glance, every time you scratched your nose or hesitated before opening a door, has been recorded, analyzed, and stored in some database you didn't even know existed. That's exactly what I figured out on day 5. Honestly, I wish I could go back to being blissfully ignorant. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Suddenly, the entire house transforms from a creepy mansion into a full-blown psychological nightmare. I was dusting the West Wing, a dark corridor where sunlight barely reaches and the air always feels 10 degrees colder than the rest of the house, when I noticed something weird. High on the wall, a camera wasn't pointing at the hallway like you'd expect for normal security. It was angled down, directly at face level. It was perfectly positioned to capture not just where I was walking, but exactly what expression I had while doing it. My first thought was that I was being paranoid, seeing patterns that weren't there because I was still freaked out about Camila. But then I started actually looking, really looking. I found them everywhere, behind decorative vases, inside smoke detectors, and one hidden lens pointed straight at me, reflecting back my own terrified eyes. Cleverly disguised as ceiling moldings, tucked into the corners of gold picture frames. There were cameras in places you'd never think to check, and every single one was positioned at eye level, aimed with surgical precision to capture facial expressions, pupil dilation, and the tiniest micro movements that most people don't even realize they're making. It hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't security, this was surveillance on a level I'd only seen in dystopian movies. Whoever was watching wasn't making sure I didn't steal the silverware. They were studying me like a lab rat in some twisted experiment. I started testing my theory over the next couple of days, and the results were absolutely terrifying. I'd walk down a hallway and deliberately change my expression, going from neutral to slightly worried. Every time I'd hear it, that faint mechanical whir. I'd see the camera pivot just barely, tracking the shift in my face like it was taking notes. I tried a more daring test. I stood before the heavy doors of the library and forced a wide, bright, completely fake smile. I held it until my cheeks ached. The response was immediate. The next morning, my chores were laughably easy. I was assigned to the sun-drenched solarium, tasked with nothing more than light dusting and watering plants. It felt like a reward. But later that afternoon, I let my guard down. I allowed myself to cry, just for a minute in the privacy of a bathroom stall. When I came out, my schedule had been updated on the digital terminal. I was reassigned to the deep basement storage rooms, the ones with no windows and air so thick it felt like breathing through wool. It was conditioning, pure and simple. They were training me like a dog to suppress my feelings and perform perfectly under pressure. They weren't just watching, they were analyzing every twitch, every hesitation, every flicker of fear to build a psychological profile that probably knew me better than I knew myself. Every choice I thought I was making freely was actually just another data point in a file with my name on it. The night I fully understood the scale of this, I was lying in bed staring at the ceiling when I saw it, a tiny pinhole lens right above my pillow. It didn't just sit there. As my eyes met the lens, the red indicator light blinked twice, as if acknowledging I'd found it. It clicked into place like the final piece of a nightmare puzzle. The cameras weren't just recording, they were learning. They were using some kind of artificial intelligence to predict my reactions, feeding a system that was essentially programming my soul. I wasn't being supervised like a normal employee. I was being evaluated like a science experiment, measured against a standard I couldn't see and graded on criteria I didn't understand. What happens when the evaluation is complete? What comes after they've collected enough data and mapped every emotional response? I pulled my knees to my chest, feeling small, exposed, and utterly powerless. I realized that from the moment I walked through those doors, I had stopped being a person and became a subject, a variable in someone's grand experiment. The house wasn't watching me to keep me safe or to make sure I did my job correctly. It was watching me to transform me into something else entirely. I spent the rest of the night practicing my neutral face in the dark, my heart racing even as I forced my breathing to stay slow and steady. I had to be perfect. I had to be what they wanted just to stay alive long enough to find a way out. But as the sun began to peek through the curtains, I caught my reflection in the window. I was smiling, not because I was happy, but because I knew the cameras were waking up. And the worst part? I had already started smiling when the cameras wanted me to. And tomorrow I knew they'd teach me something far worse. Subscribe to the channel now if you are following the story. I'm about to tell you about the dumbest, most reckless thing I've ever done in my entire life. And before you judge me, just know that sometimes the only way to understand a cage is to rattle the bars and see what happens, even if it means getting shocked in the process. It was day 8, and I was walking down the main hallway carrying a silver tea service that probably cost more than a car when I made a decision that my brain was screaming at me not to make. I was going to look at him again, deliberately, directly, right in the eyes, because I needed to know what would happen, needed to understand if the rule was just psychological control or if there were actual consequences waiting on the other side of disobedience. My heart was absolutely hammering in my chest, doing that thing where it feels like it's trying to escape through your ribs, and every rational part of me was yelling, "Abort mission! This is insane! You've seen what happens to people who break rules here." But I kept walking, kept my chin up, and when Andrew appeared at the end of the corridor, tall and unnervingly calm in his perfectly tailored suit, I didn't look away. I looked right at him, held his gaze for a full 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours, and I watched something flicker in his expression. Not anger exactly, more like recognition, like he was a chess player who just realized his opponent made an interesting move. He didn't yell, didn't storm toward me, didn't even change his pace. He just observed me with this clinical detachment that was somehow more terrifying than rage would have been. And then he turned to one of his assistants and said something I couldn't hear. And within minutes, I was being escorted to a part of the house I'd never seen before. They called it the reflection wing, which sounds peaceful and zen until you realize it's actually isolation disguised with a pretty name. And let me tell you, solitary confinement is no joke, even when the prison cell has marble floors and expensive artwork on the walls. Nobody spoke to me, nobody brought food, nobody acknowledged my existence for what felt like forever, but was probably only 12 hours. And the silence was so complete, so absolute, that I started hearing my own heartbeat like drums in my ears and questioning whether I'd made a massive mistake. The room was beautiful in that cold, untouchable way that rich people love, everything pristine and perfect and completely devoid of comfort. And I spent hours pacing back and forth, my mind racing through everything that had led me here, wondering if this was how it ended for Camila, if she'd been locked in a room just like this one before she disappeared completely. But here's the weird thing. The longer I sat there, the more I started to understand something that hadn't clicked before. This wasn't really about punishment, at least not in the traditional sense. It was about observation, about seeing how I'd react when stripped of everything familiar, when left alone with nothing but my thoughts and fears. I realized they were testing whether I'd panic, whether I'd bang on the door and scream, whether I'd break down crying or curl into a ball. And understanding that gave me this strange sense of power, because if I knew what they wanted, I could choose whether to give it to them. So I sat down in the middle of that gorgeous, awful room, crossed my legs, controlled my breathing, and forced myself to appear calm even though inside I was terrified. And I stayed like that for hours, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me crack. When the door finally opened and Andrew himself walked in, not an assistant or a guard, but him personally, I knew I'd gotten his attention in a way that went beyond simple rule breaking. He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then he said something that made my blood run cold. Most people beg to leave within the first hour. You lasted 8. That's either impressive or concerning. His voice was quiet and measured, like he was commenting on the weather instead of my psychological endurance, and I forced myself to meet his eyes again, even though every instinct screamed at me to look away. And I said as calmly as I could manage, I needed to understand what happens when someone breaks your rules. Now I know. The air between us felt electric, charged with this weird tension that wasn't quite hostility, but definitely wasn't friendliness either. And he tilted his head slightly like I was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. You broke the rule on purpose, he said. Not a question, but a statement. And I nodded because lying seemed pointless when he probably had footage of my face from 17 different angles showing exactly how calculated my decision had been. He was quiet for another moment, then said something that made me realize I'd just changed the entire game. Interesting. Most people who end up here are fleeing something, running from poverty or desperation or trauma, but you're different. You're not just surviving, you're investigating, which means either you're incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, and I haven't decided which yet. Then he walked out, leaving the door open behind him, and I sat there shaking because I'd just learned something crucial. Obedience alone wasn't what they wanted. They wanted something deeper, something more complex, and I'd accidentally stumbled into understanding that made me both more valuable and more dangerous than I'd ever intended to be. The knock on my door came at 2 in the morning, which is universally recognized as the time when nothing good ever happens. And I jolted awake so fast I nearly fell out of bed, my heart instantly racing, because who knocks on doors at 2 in the morning in a house where people disappear without a trace? I'd been back in my regular room for 3 days since the isolation incident, trying to act normal, trying to pretend everything was fine while my brain worked overtime, trying to figure out what Andrew's cryptic comments actually meant. And now someone was tapping softly but persistently on my door, like they were trying not to wake anyone else in the hallway. My first instinct was to ignore it, to pull the covers over my head and pretend I was sleeping. But curiosity has always been my fatal flaw, so I crept to the door and whispered through the wood, "Who is it?" The voice that came back made my blood freeze. "It's Leora. Let me in, quickly, before the cameras catch me here." Leora, the girl who'd supposedly quit 6 months ago, the one whose name I'd heard whispered in the same hushed tones as Camilla's, the ghost story that older staff members mentioned when they thought nobody was listening. And now she was apparently standing outside my room at 2 in the morning, asking to come in? I yanked the door open so fast it nearly flew off its hinges. She slipped inside like a shadow, grabbing my arm and dragging me to the far corner, away from the window, away from the vent, away from anywhere they might be watching. She looked different from the photo I'd seen in the staff files I'd snuck a peek at. Thinner, harder, with eyes that had seen things I probably couldn't imagine. And when she finally spoke, her voice was urgent and raw and absolutely terrified. "You need to listen very carefully because I don't have much time, and if they catch me here, we're both finished," she started, gripping my arm so tightly it hurt, and I nodded because what else could I do when a literal ghost is giving you warnings in the middle of the night? This house, these rules, the cameras, the tests, all of it, it's not what you think it is. You're not here to be a maid. None of us were. We're candidates in a program that's so much bigger and darker than you can possibly understand right now. My mind was reeling, trying to process what she was saying while simultaneously trying not to panic, and I managed to croak out, "Candidates for what?" She looked at me with this expression that was equal parts pity and fear, like she was about to tell a child that monsters are real and they live under your bed. They're building something, testing people, pushing them to see who breaks and who adapts, who follows blindly and who questions intelligently, who can withstand psychological pressure and who crumbles under it. And every single thing you've experienced since you got here has been carefully designed to measure your responses, your resilience, your potential. The words hit me like physical blows, each one landing heavier than the last, and suddenly everything made horrible, perfect sense. The cameras at eye level weren't for security, they were for behavior analysis. The isolation wasn't punishment, it was a psychological stress test. Even Camilla's disappearance wasn't random cruelty, it was data collection. "But why?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, and Leora's grip on my arm tightened even more. Because there are people out there, powerful people who need operatives, individuals who can handle extreme situations, who can be molded and controlled and trusted not to crack under pressure. And this house is where they find them, where they break you down and rebuild you into something useful. She paused, her eyes scanning the room like she expected someone to burst through the door any second, and then she delivered the line that made my entire world tilt sideways. "You're not a maid cleaning a mansion. You're a lab rat in the most sophisticated human experiment you've ever seen. And the scariest part is that you've already passed more tests than most people ever get to, which means they see potential in you, which means you're exactly the kind of person they're looking for." I wanted to argue, to tell her she was crazy, to insist that this was just a weird job with eccentric rules, but every single thing she said aligned perfectly with what I'd observed, with the patterns I'd noticed, with the gut feeling I'd been trying to ignore since day one. "What happened to you?" I asked, and her face darkened in a way that told me the answer was nothing good. "I made it to the final stage. I was given an offer just like you're about to be, and I said no. I tried to run and tried to expose them, and they made sure nobody would ever believe me by destroying every piece of evidence that I'd ever worked here. Every record, every photo, every connection I had to this place just vanished like it never existed." She was shaking now, genuinely trembling, and I realized that coming back here to warn me had taken more courage than I could comprehend. "So why are you telling me this? Why risk everything to warn someone you don't even know?" I asked, and Leora's grip on my arm tightened even more. "Because I couldn't save myself, but maybe I can save you, or at least give you the choice I never had, the choice to go into the final phase knowing exactly what you're walking into, instead of stumbling in blind and desperate." Then she moved toward the door, pausing just before she opened it to look back at me one last time. "They're going to offer you something soon, something that seems like salvation, like the answer to all your problems. And when they do, remember this conversation. Remember that every person you see working in this house as something other than a maid started exactly where you are now. And ask yourself if the price of survival is worth what you'll have to become." The door clicked shut behind her, and I stood there in the darkness, my entire understanding of reality fractured into pieces I didn't know how to put back together, because I just learned that I wasn't surviving a weird job. I was being systematically transformed into something else entirely. If you're curious, hit the subscribe and give the video a thumbs up. I'm going to tell you about the moment I stopped being a victim and started being something far more dangerous. And it happened in a room that technically didn't exist, hidden behind a bookshelf in the West Wing that I only found because I tripped over a loose floorboard and heard something weird echo beneath my feet. The sound was wrong, completely wrong, like there was empty space where there should have been solid foundation. And my curiosity, that same fatal flaw that had gotten me into this mess, absolutely refused to let it go. So I started pressing on panels and pulling on shelves until one of them shifted with a soft click that made my heart jump into my throat. The door that swung open looked like something out of a spy movie, all hidden hinges and seamless integration with the wall. And beyond it was a staircase, leading down into a soft blue glow that definitely didn't belong in a billionaire's mansion. And every sane part of my brain was screaming, "Turn around, walk away, pretend you never saw this." But I've never been particularly good at listening to the sane parts of my brain. I descended those stairs with my phone's flashlight trembling in my hand, each step creaking softly under my weight. And when I reached the bottom, what I saw made me freeze completely, because this wasn't just a hidden room, this was a command center, a laboratory, a surveillance hub that looked like it could monitor half the city, with banks of computers humming quietly, multiple screens displaying live feeds from cameras I recognized and dozens I didn't, and filing cabinets that practically screamed classified information. My hands were shaking as I approached the nearest desk, covered in manila folders organized with the kind of obsessive precision that told me everything here mattered, everything had purpose. And when I opened the first folder labeled Staff Histories, my stomach dropped so fast I thought I might actually throw up. Because these weren't employment records, these were psychological profiles so detailed and invasive they knew things about these people that they probably didn't know about themselves. Every folder contained a complete breakdown: childhood trauma, family dysfunction, financial desperation, behavioral patterns, fear responses, manipulation vulnerabilities, even predictions about how they'd react to specific scenarios. And I recognized names, saw faces of people I'd worked alongside, people who'd disappeared or been promoted, or simply vanished from conversation like they'd never existed. The clinical detachment in the notes was terrifying. Phrases like high compliance potential and resistant to authority, requires additional conditioning, and suitable for phase 3 extraction, whatever that meant, written in the same tone you'd use to describe ingredients in a recipe, rather than human beings with lives and dreams and families. I flipped through folder after folder, my horror growing with each page, until I found one that made time stop completely. A folder with my name on it, and not just recent information, but data going back months before I'd even applied for this job, like they'd been watching me, studying me, selecting me from some twisted pool of desperate candidates who fit whatever twisted criteria they were using. My photo stared back at me from a page dated 3 months before my first day, and beneath it was a breakdown so accurate, so invasive, that I felt physically violated. Every financial struggle, every bad relationship, every moment of desperation that had led me to that job posting, all documented and analyzed, like I was a lab specimen. The worst part? The rating system: obedience, adaptability, intelligence, emotional stability, capacity for deception, and at the top of my file, in bold red letters, high potential, approved for final phase. I had to grip the edge of the desk to keep from collapsing, because this meant everything, absolutely everything since I'd arrived, had been orchestrated, and I wasn't just an employee or even a test subject. I was a candidate in some program I didn't understand, being groomed for something they called the final phase, and the implications of that made my mind spiral into dark places I didn't want to explore. I forced myself to keep searching, knowing that discovery could come at any moment, and what I found next on the computer screens made everything else seem almost trivial by comparison, because one monitor displayed a ledger, a digital spreadsheet tracking phases of the program with clinical precision: initiation, observation, conditioning, evaluation, and finally, ominously, final phase. And under each category were names, dozens of them, some I recognized and many I didn't, with status markers like graduated, failed, in progress, and most chilling of all, terminated. I scrolled through the list with trembling fingers, seeing Camilla's name marked as failed, removed, Leora's marked as graduated, deployed, and my own name sitting squarely in the final phase column with a status that just said active. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker, and I understood with absolute crushing clarity that I wasn't cleaning a mansion or surviving a weird job. I was participating in human experimentation on a scale I couldn't fully comprehend, and every person who'd walked through those doors had been carefully selected, tested, and either molded into something useful or discarded when they failed to meet standards I still didn't understand. I grabbed my phone and started taking pictures, hands shaking so badly I had to take some shots 3 or 4 times to get them clear, documenting everything I could, because this was evidence, real proof that something deeply wrong was happening here. And if I was going to survive this, if I was going to escape or fight back or do anything besides become another name in their database, I needed leverage.
But even as I photographed files and screens, a horrible realization crept over me. If they were this sophisticated, this thorough, this obsessed with monitoring and control, how could they not know I was here right now? How could this room really be unguarded or unwatched, unless my finding it itself was part of the test, another layer of evaluation to see what I'd do with information I wasn't supposed to have? And that thought, that paranoid but possibly accurate thought, made me realize I might have just walked into a trap disguised as a discovery. I backed toward the stairs, pocketing my phone with its incriminating photos, taking one last look at the command center that had just revealed the true nature of my existence here. And as I climbed back up toward the hidden door, I knew with absolute certainty that nothing would ever be the same, because I'd seen behind the curtain, understood the machinery that had been grinding me down, and whether this discovery had been allowed or genuine, I now had something I didn't have before. Knowledge, dangerous and terrifying knowledge that made me either incredibly valuable or incredibly expendable, and I wouldn't know which until it was probably too late.
The day Andrew finally explained everything was the day I realized I'd been living in a completely different reality than I thought. Like finding out the movie you've been watching was actually a documentary and you're one of the subjects. And honestly, I'm still not sure if I wish I'd never learned the truth or if knowing was the only thing that gave me a fighting chance. He called me to his office, not the public one where he occasionally met with staff, but the real one, the private sanctuary deep in the East Wing where normal employees were absolutely never allowed. And when I walked in, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, but soundproof quiet. The kind that makes you realize nobody would hear you scream. Andrew was standing by the window, hands clasped behind his back, looking every bit the billionaire genius that magazines probably wrote about. And when he turned to face me, his expression wasn't angry or pleased. It was clinical, like a scientist about to explain a particularly interesting experiment to a colleague. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to a leather chair that probably cost more than my entire childhood. And I sat because what else was I going to do? And that's when he dropped the bomb that made everything click into horrible, perfect focus. "You've been asking questions, making observations, testing boundaries, and normally that would be grounds for immediate termination. But in your case, it's exactly what we've been hoping to see, because intelligence combined with courage is remarkably rare, and we've been searching for people like you for a very long time." My stomach dropped because the way he said "people like you" made it sound like I was a rare species he'd been hunting, and I forced myself to ask the question I already knew would have a terrifying answer. "What do you mean, searching for people?" He smiled, not warmly, but not cruelly either, more like a teacher pleased that a student finally asked the right question, and he began pacing slowly around the room, his voice measured and calm in a way that made the content even more disturbing. "This house, these rules, the entire structure you've been navigating, it's not about cleaning or service or any conventional employment. It's a selection program designed to identify individuals with specific psychological profiles, people who can endure extreme stress, adapt to impossible situations, follow complex instructions under pressure, and most importantly, maintain loyalty even when their moral compass is screaming at them to run." He paused, letting that sink in, and I felt my hands gripping the armrest so tightly my knuckles turned white. Every person who walks through those doors is screened, analyzed, and tested across hundreds of metrics: resilience, obedience, creativity under constraint, emotional regulation, capacity for deception, ability to compartmentalize trauma, and we measure all of this through the cameras, through the tasks we assign, through the rules you're forced to break or follow, through every single interaction you have in this house. My brain was spinning, trying to process the scale of what he was describing, and I managed to choke out, "But why? What's the point of creating these operatives?"
His smile widened slightly, and that's when I saw it. The absolute certainty of someone who believes they're doing something important, even necessary. Because the world runs on power, real power, the kind that exists in shadows, in boardrooms, in private conversations that never make the news. And the people who hold that power need individuals they can trust, people who've been tested beyond what normal vetting could ever achieve. Agents who can handle delicate situations, gather information, maintain perfect discretion, and execute complex instructions without question. He stopped directly in front of me, his eyes boring into mine with an intensity that made me want to look away, but I forced myself to hold his gaze. You were never hired as a maid. You were selected as a candidate, chosen specifically because your background, your desperation, your intelligence, and your psychological profile suggested you might have what we're looking for. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the air getting thicker, harder to breathe, and I finally understood the full scope of what I'd stumbled into. This wasn't just some eccentric billionaire with weird rules. This was an entire industry, a pipeline that took desperate people and transformed them into tools for the powerful. "What happens if I refuse?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. And Andrew's expression shifted slightly, not quite sympathy, but something close to respect. "Then you leave, we erase all evidence of your time here, you receive a substantial severance payment to ensure your silence, and you go back to whatever life you had before, assuming you can live with the knowledge of what you've seen and what you walked away from." He leaned against his desk, arms crossed, watching my face like he was reading data off a screen. "But here's what I suspect you're really asking. What happens if you say yes?" And the answer is that you become part of something larger than yourself. You receive training, resources, protection, a new identity if necessary, and you join a network of individuals who've proven themselves capable of operating in the spaces between law and necessity. My mind flashed to the women I'd glimpsed in hallways, the ones who moved with confidence and purpose, the ones who'd supposedly disappeared but had actually graduated to something else entirely, and I realized with a sickening clarity that this offer wasn't generosity, it was the final test. "You're not cruel," I said, quietly, more to myself than to him. "You're worse. You're systematic. You've turned human desperation into a business model, and you've convinced yourself it's justified because the people you serve have power." Andrew didn't deny it, didn't even flinch. He just nodded slowly, like I'd finally understood the lesson. Cruelty is random, chaotic, pointless, but what we do here is none of those things. Every rule exists for a reason, every test has a purpose, every punishment teaches a lesson, and yes, we exploit desperation, but we also offer transformation. We take people whose society has failed and give them a chance to become extraordinary, and the fact that you're sitting here having this conversation means you've already proven you're more than what you were when you arrived. The weight of his words settled over me like a heavy cloak, and I realized that everything, absolutely everything, from the moment I saw that job posting had been orchestrated to lead me to this exact moment, this exact choice. And the most terrifying part wasn't that I was trapped, it was that some small part of me was actually considering saying yes. The hallway Andrew led me down didn't exist on any map or blueprint I'd seen. That should have been my first clue. With each step, my heart hammered harder. Whatever waited behind that door would force me to make a choice that would define the rest of my life. The door itself was unremarkable, just polished wood and a simple handle, but when it swung open, I stepped into a room that made my breath catch in my throat because it looked like mission control for something way bigger than a private mansion. Computer screens lined the walls, displaying data I couldn't fully comprehend. Surveillance feeds from what looks like dozens of different locations, and in the center of it all, moving with practiced efficiency and undeniable confidence, were women, maybe 15 or 20 of them, dressed not in maid uniforms, but in sleek professional attire that screamed competence and power. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing, and then recognition hit me like a physical blow.
I knew these faces, not all of them, but enough, because these were the girls who disappeared, the ones whose names had been erased from schedules, the ghosts that staff members whispered about when they thought nobody was listening. They hadn't vanished into thin air or met some terrible fate. They'd graduated, transformed from desperate workers into whatever this was, and watching them move through that space with purpose and certainty made something twist uncomfortably in my chest, because part of me was horrified and part of me was envious. Andrew's voice cut through my shock like a knife. This is what saying yes looks like. These women started exactly where you are now, cleaning floors and following rules, and now they work for some of the most powerful people in the world. They gather intelligence, manage sensitive situations, ensure that certain information reaches the right people, and other information never sees daylight. And in return, they have security, resources, and protection that most people can't even imagine. He gestured around the room with something that looked almost like pride, and I realized with growing horror that he genuinely believed he was offering salvation, not exploitation. One of the women noticed me and walked over, her smile professional but not unkind, and when she spoke, her voice had that same measured quality that everyone in this house seemed to develop. I remember my first time seeing this room. It's overwhelming, I get it, but you should know that accepting the offer was the best decision I ever made, because out there I was nobody, just another broke girl with no options and no future. And in here, I'm somebody who matters, who has skills and value and a purpose. Her words should have been comforting, but instead they felt like a sales pitch, carefully crafted to appeal to exactly the kind of desperation I'd been drowning in when I first arrived. And I found myself wondering how much of what she said was genuine belief and how much was programming. Andrew moved closer, his presence commanding attention even in a room full of capable people, and delivered the line I'd been dreading. So here's your choice. Join us and receive training, resources, a new identity if you need one, access to a network that can open doors you didn't know existed, or decline and return to whatever life you had before. Though I should mention that declining comes with certain conditions, primarily your permanent silence about everything you've seen here, enforced by legal agreements and financial incentives that make speaking out extraordinarily costly. The unspoken threat hung in the air like smoke, and I understood perfectly what he wasn't saying. People who refused probably did leave, probably did get paid, but they also probably lived the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders, wondering if sharing the wrong detail with the wrong person would bring consequences. My eyes swept the room again, cataloging faces and trying to imagine their stories, trying to picture the moment each of them stood where I was standing and made the choice that led them here. And I noticed something that made my stomach clench. They all looked successful, polished, confident, but none of them looked happy. Not really. There was something missing behind their eyes, some spark or lightness that had been traded away for security and purpose. "How long do I have to decide?" I asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded when inside I was screaming. And Andrew checked his watch like we were discussing a business meeting instead of the trajectory of my entire existence. 24 hours. After that, the offer expires and you'll be processed for departure. And I should mention that this conversation, like everything else, is being recorded. So whatever you decide, make sure it's what you actually want, because we'll know if you're lying. He said it casually, like it was just another piece of information, but the implications made my skin crawl, because it meant even my decision wasn't really private, wasn't really mine. It would be analyzed and measured and judged, just like everything else. I looked around the room one more time, at the women who traded one kind of cage for another, at the screens displaying power and control and surveillance, at Andrew standing there with absolute certainty that he was offering me something valuable. And I realized that this moment was the culmination of every test, every camera, every rule I'd followed or broken. They'd been preparing me for this choice since day one, softening me up, breaking down my resistance, showing me both the consequences of disobedience and the rewards of compliance.
And now here I stood at the crossroads with 24 hours to decide if I wanted to become the kind of person who could work in this room and sleep at night. Subscribe now, because what I decided next shocked everyone, including myself. I left the room, elevator doors sliding shut behind me, and caught my reflection. In my eyes, I saw the calculation already beginning, the part of me that had started thinking like someone who belonged in that world. Had I already made my choice without realizing it? I said yes, and the moment the word left my mouth, I felt something fundamental shift inside me, like a door closing that I'd never be able to open again. But here's the thing, nobody tells you about making impossible choices. Sometimes you say yes out loud while planning no in your head. And that's exactly what I did, because I'd learned enough in that house to know that survival required playing the game while secretly rewriting the rules. Andrew's face registered satisfaction, that subtle expression of a chess player watching their opponent make the expected move, and he extended his hand for a handshake that felt more like a contract signed in blood than a simple greeting, and I shook it firmly while mentally cataloging every detail of the room, every face, every piece of equipment, because I knew that if I was going to take this system down, I needed to understand it from the inside first. The training started immediately, and I mean immediately. Like within hours, I was being taught things that made my previous life feel like a distant dream. Advanced surveillance techniques, psychological manipulation tactics, how to read micro-expressions and exploit emotional vulnerabilities, how to blend into any social situation, regardless of class or context, and most disturbingly, how to lie so convincingly that even polygraphs couldn't detect the deception. They were good. Terrifyingly good at what they did, and I found myself absorbing the information like a sponge, because knowledge is power, and I needed every advantage I could get if I was going to survive long enough to expose what was happening here. But here's where it gets complicated, messier than I ever anticipated. The more I learned, the more I started to understand their perspective. Not agree with it exactly, but understand how people could convince themselves that what they were doing was necessary, even noble, because they genuinely believed they were creating order in a chaotic world, protecting important people from threats, maintaining stability that benefited everyone, even if the methods were questionable. It was seductive in the most dangerous way, this logic that said the ends justified the means, and I caught myself multiple times almost buying into it, almost believing that maybe I could do good within this corrupt system. And that's when I knew I was in real danger, because the most effective trap isn't the one that holds you against your will, it's the one that makes you want to stay. 3 weeks into my new role, I was assigned my first real task. Nothing dramatic or illegal, just gathering information about a business rival's upcoming merger by attending a charity gala and making conversation with the right people. And I executed it flawlessly, smiled at the right moments, asked the right questions, extracted the information without anyone realizing they'd given it away. And when I delivered my report, Andrew actually looked impressed, which should have felt like victory, but instead felt like betrayal of everything I'd promised myself I wouldn't become. The worst part was how easy it was, how natural it felt to slip into that role, to be charming and deceptive and effective. And I started to wonder if maybe this was who I'd always been underneath the desperation and fear. Maybe the house hadn't created a monster, maybe it had just revealed one that was already there. I had been secretly recording everything, collecting evidence, documenting the program with a tiny device I'd managed to smuggle in, planning to eventually leak it all to authorities or journalists or someone who could actually do something about it. But as the weeks turned into months, my resolution started to waver, because where would I go? What would I do? Who would even believe me when I had no proof except recordings that could be dismissed as fabricated or taken out of context? The other women, my fellow operatives, started to feel less like fellow prisoners and more like colleagues. We'd share dark jokes about our assignments, trade tips on handling difficult situations, and sometimes late at night we'd sit together in the common room and I'd wonder if they'd all started like me, full of righteous anger and plans for rebellion, only to gradually realize that resistance was exhausting and maybe survival was enough. Then came the day that shattered whatever illusions I'd been clinging to. The day a new girl arrived, and I watched her walk through those doors with the same desperate hope I'd had months earlier, clutching her paperwork like it was a life raft, and I felt something twist in my chest because I knew exactly what was coming for her, knew every test and manipulation and psychological breaking point she'd face. Andrew called me to his office that afternoon and handed me a folder with her information, her trauma history, her psychological vulnerabilities, her family situation, everything they'd used to control and shape her. And he said with absolute casual certainty, "You'll be her mentor. Guide her through the initial phases, help her understand the rules, and most importantly, help her see the opportunity we're offering instead of the trap she might perceive." The folder felt heavy in my hands, heavier than paper should ever feel, and I realized with horrifying clarity that this was my final test, not the surveillance or the assignments or the training, but this moment where I had to decide if I would actively recruit the next victim, if I would become not just a participant in the system, but an enforcer of it. I walked down to the main entrance where she was waiting, this girl who couldn't have been more than 22, with eyes that still held optimism despite whatever hardships had brought her here, and when I approached her with my practiced smile and measured voice, I saw myself reflected in her nervous expression, saw the person I used to be before the cameras and tests and compromises had worn me down into someone I barely recognized. "Welcome," I said, my voice steady and professional, and I handed her the rule sheet, the same one I'd received on my first day, the one that started with rule number 1 in bold letters: never look him in the eye. She took it with trembling hands and whispered "thank you," like I was doing her a favor instead of leading her into the same beautiful nightmare that had consumed me. And as I watched her read through the rules, her forehead creasing with concentration and confusion, I understood the full weight of what I'd become. I wasn't a rebel anymore, wasn't an undercover hero collecting evidence to bring down a corrupt system. I was a cog in the machine, smoothed and polished and perfectly functional. And the most terrifying part was that I wasn't sure I wanted to fight it anymore, because fighting was exhausting and conforming was so much easier. And maybe that's exactly how they won. Not by breaking you with force, but by making you break yourself. The cycle was complete. The next girl had arrived, hungry and desperate, just like I had been. And as I watched her, part of me mourned the girl I once was. That girl was gone. Forever. If you made it here, then it is a sign you are destined for this. Subscribe to the channel and give the video a thumbs up. Thanks for watching.